Very disturbing rest stop horror stories. It had been one of those days. The kind where time stretches on forever, where the road seems endless and every mile looks the same. Andrea was already weary, the road mirroring her tired mind. The night was dragging, each hour merging into the next, each passing second making her feel more isolated. Her eyes were heavy, and the quiet hum of the engine was like a lullaby. Soothing, yes, but in a way that made her feel even more alone. She hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours, and the darkness around her seemed to press in from all sides. Then, out of nowhere, a sign. A dim, almost faded rest stop sign. Andrea squinted, unsure if she had imagined it. It had appeared suddenly, without warning. Her eyes darted to the dashboard, checking the time. Late. Too late. She hadn't planned to stop, but her body... She needed a break. The thought of just getting out of the car for a few minutes was a relief. She took the turn. The gravel crunched under her tires, the headlights sweeping across an empty parking lot. Not a soul in sight. The cold air of the night met her as she stepped out of the car, the stillness unnerving. No other cars, no other people. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong. She glanced at the building in front of her. It was old, worn out and a little neglected. A single light flickered above the entrance, casting long, distorted shadows. The rest stop, it seemed, had been forgotten by time. She hesitated. For a moment, Andrea stood there, staring at the dimly lit building. It looked like a relic, abandoned by those who once stopped here. A relic she had now come across, perhaps too late. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the hinges protesting loudly. She winced, the sound sharp in the otherwise still night. The air inside smelled stale, musty, like it had been shut up for too long. There was no one behind the counter, no workers, no customers. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding louder than she intended in the empty space. The echo made her shiver, but there was no answer. Nothing. She made her way to the restrooms, the hallway dark and eerily silent. As her footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, she noticed how the flickering lights overhead made the shadows twist unnaturally. It was like the place was alive, breathing, waiting, watching. When she reached the restroom, the door was ajar. She paused. Her heart raced for a split second. She hadn't noticed anyone coming in, and yet the door was open. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Was someone in there? Her mind screamed at her to turn around to walk back outside, but her curiosity overpowered her hesitation. She pushed the door open, half expecting to find the room empty. But she didn't. The space inside was dark, and she could barely make out the outline of the sink and cracked tiles on the floor. The bathroom was wrong. She felt it before she saw it. There was a coldness in the air that wasn't natural, and it felt thick, almost suffocating. The mirror above the sink was cracked, distorting her reflection as though it didn't quite want to show her face. And that's when she heard it. A soft sound. A rustling. Andrea froze. The sound came from behind her. Something scraping against the floor. It was subtle at first. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, but nothing. The room was still empty. No one. No movement. Her breath hitched, her hands trembled. What was happening? She backed toward the door, but as she did, the sound came again. Closer. Closer. A faint shuffle of footsteps, slow, deliberate. She whirled around. Nothing. Only the mirror, reflecting the distorted image of the bathroom, a small patch of light from the overhead flickering. But then the voice came. "Get out." It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Her heart stopped. Her body went cold. It didn't feel like she had a choice. Something in her chest tightened as she backed out of the restroom. Her legs felt like lead, but somehow she managed to move. She stumbled into the hallway, her breath coming in short gasps. She needed to leave. She had to leave, but... The voice followed her. Leave now. It was louder now, but it felt distant, as if it were all around her. She was panicking. Her mind raced as she turned toward the door, no more second guessing. She had to leave now. But the hallway stretched out before her, longer than she remembered. The walls seemed to press in on her. The light overhead flickered again, casting odd shadows along the walls. It wasn't just the building. The very air had changed. The heaviness, the weight of it was suffocating. The space felt wrong. And then, the footsteps. They were there again, slow, deliberate, the scraping sound of shoes dragging across the floor. They were getting closer. She could hear them closer. Closer than before. Her legs moved before her brain could even process the fear that was coursing through her. She ran, fast. The door was so close now, but somehow it felt farther away than it had before. She could barely breathe. Every step felt like it was dragging her back toward that horrible sound. She reached for the handle. It wouldn't open. The panic surged through her chest. Her fingers fumbled for the door. It wouldn't open. Why wouldn't it open? The footsteps were so close now. So close she could feel the air move with every slow, deliberate step. Don't run. The voice was clear now. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. Don't run. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she pulled with all her strength. She needed to get out of here. She had to. With one final desperate yank, the door opened. She stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath, her body shaking violently. The wind felt like a slap to her face, the sudden change of temperature sharp against her skin. But she didn't care. She didn't care about the cold. She just needed to leave. She ran. She didn't look back. Her car was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. She fumbled for her keys, her hands unsteady, and when she finally got the door open, she slammed it shut behind her. She started the car. But as she drove away, she didn't dare look back. And as the rest stop grew smaller in her rearview mirror, she could have sworn. She saw something standing in the shadows, something watching her. The voice lingered in her head. You shouldn't have come here. This is Most Creepy Rest Stop Horror Story number 2. Michelle had been driving for what seemed like an eternity, the monotonous hum of the tires on the road making everything feel distant and unreal. The last few hours blurred together. She could barely keep her eyes open. The endless stretches of highway were swallowing her up, leaving her feeling more isolated with each passing mile. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in hours. The fatigue was settling deep into her bones, but there was nothing she could do. She had to keep going. She had no choice. Then, just as she was starting to lose hope of finding anything familiar, a small, dimly lit rest stop appeared in the distance. She almost didn't see it at first, but the faint glow of its lights beckoned her in. It was a welcome sight after what felt like endless miles of nothing. She pulled her car into the lot, the tires crunching on the gravel. The lot was nearly empty, just a few other cars scattered here and there. The air felt different, though. Quiet. Still. She stepped out of the car, feeling the cold hit her skin. It was a sharp kind of cold, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The rest stop itself was old, run down. The lights flickered like they were holding on to life by a thread. The building looked abandoned, but there was still a sense of activity, or maybe it was just the illusion of it. She couldn't quite place it. Taking a deep breath, Michelle told herself that she needed to stretch her legs, get something to drink, and use the bathroom. The door to the rest stop creaked as she entered, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of something she couldn't quite identify. There was a faint metallic tang to it, as if the place hadn't been cleaned in years. It made her stomach churn, but she pushed through, her fatigue outweighing her discomfort. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way down the narrow hall toward the bathroom. As she approached the door, she noticed that it was slightly ajar. Odd. She paused, looking around, but there was no one else in sight. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bathroom was dimly lit, the tiles cracked and stained. There was no one in there. She took a deep breath, relieved, but the relief didn't last. The silence. It was too thick, too heavy. There was something wrong. She could feel it. She splashed water on her face, trying to shake off the exhaustion that was weighing down on her. Her mind was foggy, her thoughts scattered. As she looked up at the cracked mirror, something in her reflection made her stop. Her eyes widened. Something was off, but she couldn't figure out what. It was like a sense of unease, like the mirror was reflecting something that wasn't there, a presence that she couldn't place. Suddenly, a faint noise, a shuffle, echoed behind her. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It was so quiet, so soft. But there was no mistaking it. She wasn't alone. Someone was in the room with her. She could feel it. Her body tensed, her heart pounding against her chest. She slowly turned her head, scanning the room. No one. There was no one there. But that sense of being watched didn't go away. She felt it now more than ever. The air was thick with it, pressing against her chest. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. She needed to leave. Now Michelle quickly turned back to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The noise, the shuffle. It had come from behind her, but the room was empty. She was sure of it. She wasn't imagining things. Her stomach twisted as she glanced toward the doorway again, and that's when she saw him. A man. His figure was barely visible in the dim light. He stood just outside the bathroom door, so still that at first she thought he might be a trick of the light, but no. He was there. Her breath hitched, her pulse raced, and for a split second she couldn't move. The man's face was hidden in shadow. He didn't say a word. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, watching her. Her eyes locked with his. There was something wrong with him. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like he was waiting for something. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But her legs wouldn't move. He took a step forward. Michelle's heart felt like it stopped. The sound of his footsteps, so soft, yet so deliberate, made the hairs on her neck rise. The silence between them was unbearable. And then, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was low, quiet. His words were sharp, like a warning. Michelle's throat went dry. She swallowed hard, struggling to find her voice. But nothing came. What did he mean? Why was he here? She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was frozen, trapped in the horror of the moment. His eyes remained fixed on hers, unblinking, cold. "Leave now," he said again. The air felt heavier, suffocating. The panic surged within her, taking control. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs were stiff, like they couldn't obey. He took another step forward. Michelle's body jolted. With a sharp, terrified gasp, she forced herself to move. She spun toward the door, her hand grasping at the handle, fumbling with it. She heard the shuffle of his footsteps again, closer this time. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might explode. She slammed the bathroom door behind her and bolted across the lot, her feet pounding the gravel. The cold air hit her face, the taste of panic on her tongue. Her car. She needed to get to her car. She scrambled for her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The footsteps were getting closer. She didn't stop. Finally, she found the keys, unlocked the car, and threw herself inside. The engine roared to life as she slammed the door shut. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. In her rearview mirror, she could see him, the man, standing in the shadows, watching her leave. His figure was a silhouette against the dim light of the rest stop. The fear in her chest didn't subside as she sped down the highway. Was she safe? Would he follow her? What did he want? The questions raced through her mind. But all she could do was drive, faster and faster, away from that place. As the rest stop disappeared behind her, the feeling that something was following her, something watching her, lingered in the pit of her stomach. It was there, gnawing at her, even as she drove further into the night. It was as if the terror hadn't left her. And no matter how fast she drove, no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the feeling that the man's eyes were still on her. Waiting. Watching. This is the scariest rest stop horror story number 3. The dimming sky had an unsettling weight to it as Mary drove along the long, empty stretch of highway. The sun, now only a sliver of orange against the horizon, seemed to drag its descent into darkness, leaving the world outside coated in an eerie, creeping twilight. The road was lonely, too lonely. No other cars, no signs of life, just the rhythmic hum of her tires and the oppressive quiet of the world around her. She felt exposed, small, vulnerable. She was tired, a kind of exhaustion that made her question whether it was safer to stop or if she should push through the night. Her eyes were heavy, struggling to stay open. The road seemed endless. Just when she thought she might lose her grip on the wheel, a faint light flickered in the distance. A rest stop. A gas station, perhaps. A place to stop, stretch her legs, and breathe for a few minutes. Reluctantly, she pulled her car to a slow halt in front of the rundown station. Her headlights barely illuminated the area in front of her. The faded sign, barely legible, flapped weakly in the breeze. She hadn't seen a gas station in miles. This was a relief, even if the place looked like it had been abandoned for years. She sighed, wiped a tired hand over her face, and stepped out of the car. The air hit her like a cold slap, chilling, unwelcoming. The trees around the rest stop swayed slightly, their branches creaking as if complaining against the wind. She glanced around the empty parking lot, trying to shake the odd feeling rising in her chest. There were no other cars, no people. It was just quiet. Too quiet. She glanced at the dark building in front of her, then took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, her footsteps almost too loud against the gravel. As she reached the door, the low buzz of the flickering street lamp above her was the only sound she could hear. Everything else felt wrong, like the whole world had stopped. With a steadying breath, she pushed open the door. The inside of the rest stop felt abandoned. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something old, something that hadn't been touched in years. It was silent, unnaturally so. Even the buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead was faint, as if struggling to stay alive. The faded signs on the walls, the chipped counters, the long-forgotten coffee cups all spoke of neglect, of isolation, of no one here. Still, she told herself it was just a stop, just a place to stretch her legs. "Hello?" Her voice cracked in the silence, a little too loud. She winced, as if it had disturbed the very air around her. No answer. She waited. The silence pressed in harder. "Hello?" she called again, her voice shaking slightly now. Still no response. Her heart rate picked up. It was an old place. Maybe no one was working tonight. Maybe it had been closed for hours. She almost turned around to leave, but something stopped her. The bathroom was just down the hall. "You can just go in and get out," she told herself. "You'll be fine." She moved toward the back hallway, but as she did, an uncomfortable sensation settled in her chest, a pressure that made her breathe faster, her pulse quicken. Something was wrong. Something didn't feel right. Her feet felt heavy as she walked down the hallway, but she forced herself to keep moving. The bathroom door was cracked open. She hesitated, but only for a moment. The cold air from the other side made her skin crawl. She stepped inside. The bathroom was empty. No one was there, no sign of life. It was just as run down as the rest stop itself. Grimy mirrors, cracked tiles, that same faint smell of old dust. But as she stood there, hand hovering over the sink, something in the air shifted. A sound, faint but distinct. A scrape. Her eyes widened as she froze in place. It was so soft she almost convinced herself it was nothing, but then it came again. A deliberate, slow scrape, like fingernails running down a metal surface. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs louder than the scrape. It couldn't be. It's just the building settling. The wind, she tried to reason, but the knot of dread in her stomach grew tighter with each passing second. Another scrape. Her legs went stiff as she slowly turned her head, her eyes darting toward the bathroom door. Was someone out there? Her pulse raced as she stared at the door. Her mind was screaming at her to run, to get out, but her body wouldn't obey. She heard the sound again, louder this time, and she knew. Something was out there. Something was waiting. The scrape came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice. Low, hoarse, almost like it was coming from the depths of the earth. A whisper. "You're not leaving." Her blood ran cold. She didn't even move at first. She couldn't. The words felt like ice in her veins. She was paralyzed, unable to even breathe properly. Her whole body screamed at her to run, but she was rooted to the spot. Her hands shook as she slowly backed away from the sink, inch by inch. "You're not leaving." The voice was clearer now, closer. A sickly chill gripped her chest. Her thoughts scattered in a frenzy. She had to leave. She had to run. Her feet finally found the courage to move. She rushed toward the door, hands trembling as she pulled it open. She didn't stop to look back as she bolted out of the bathroom. The silence outside the restroom was louder than ever, suffocating her. She didn't dare look behind her. Every step toward the exit felt like an eternity. Her heart was beating so loud, she thought it might burst from her chest. The gravel crunched under her shoes, but it sounded like it was far too loud, like something was getting closer, something following her every move. Finally, she reached her car. With trembling hands, she fumbled for the keys, her breath shallow and erratic. The engine started with a lurch, and without hesitation, she slammed the car into drive and sped out of the parking lot. She didn't care where she was going, just away. Away from that place. As she glanced in the rearview mirror, her eyes met the dark, empty rest stop behind her. That voice. That thing. It was still there, lurking, waiting. "You're not leaving." The words echoed in her mind, and she knew deep down she might have driven away, but she hadn't truly left. Not yet.